Hey, everybody, welcome back to the program. Been interviewing a lot of really great state legislators across our beautiful state. And this week we have with us Dan Foreman from Moscow, state senator, really great voter from that area. And Dan, my gosh, the first thing that would come to mind to ask you is, a lot of folks get elected from kind of what they would call a blue-ish district, and that's certainly what people would think of the university district that you're from. Voting kind of left of center to keep the constituents happy. You've gone the other direction. You've leaned into your conservative credentials. What's that like for you? Did you get a lot of pushback for that, or is that something people have come to expect from you, or what?
Well, it's interesting for sure, and I was counseled by the pundits, and the so-called self-proclaimed political experts that don't let people know you're conservative, don't let people know you're Christian or family-oriented, et cetera, because it doesn't play in Peoria. Well, I actually went to school in Peoria, Illinois, so I know what plays in Peoria, and what plays is the truth. For decades, the conservatives and the Republican Party have kept quiet. Part of that is we're generally not agitators by nature. We're raising our families, paying our taxes, working hard, just being good citizens. And we tend to not be out on the street corner with banners and signs. But it's time that we started doing those things. And my approach has been just tell the truth and let the chips fall. My district, before redistricting, things were worse. We had Benoit County, which was a great county, but its voter base was so small compared to what we have now that it was a real horse race for any conservative candidate. The margin of victory was 1 to 1.5%, 2 to 500 votes. So it was a horse race, and it still is. But after redistricting, we picked up most of Nez Perce County and all of Lewis County. And of course, we have Latah. And that actually improved things for us. It broadened our conservative voter base. But yeah, it's a it's a chore. I've found that my support seems to be increasing in conservative circles over the years. And I think a lot of that has to do with people aren't being silent anymore because they're scared. They see what's going on in Idaho and across the nation, and it's dawned on them it's time to get involved within their own spheres of influence. They need to do whatever they can do to fight back. And if they don't, well, they better be prepared to lose all the things they hold dear in this republic. So it's a battle. Lewis County and Nez Perce County, I took, I think, 72 to 77% of the vote. Latah County, because of the university influence, it's more of a battle. It's really hard to win in Latah. We're improving the odds with every election, and we have enough horsepower to win district wide. But yeah, it's a battle, and I think most of the folks know where I stand now, so I'm not confronted as often as I was when I first started. I think people were shell-shocked to hear a conservative actually stand up in Latah County and advocate for conservative principles. And they didn't like it. One thing about hardcore liberals and leftists and globalists is they're used to getting their way. And when something or someone stands in front of them and becomes an obstacle to what they wish to accomplish, they get angry really fast. Well, let them get angry because the conservatives are angry. It's quite frankly time to stand up. So that's my approach. I ignored all the sage advice from the politicians and the coaches and who said, don't say this and don't say that. And I said, well, we need to say these things. That's exactly how we got into this mess by being silent. So it's a battle.
What's a thing that you've been coached not to say that you go around saying and your constituents seem to be liking from you?
Yeah. Well, number one is don't bring up the religious basis of America. Don't bring up our Judeo-Christian heritage and sense of morality. And don't bring up the Constitution, because I've been told that if you bring up either of those two issues, you'll be branded as an extremist. And that's the operative word on the left these days, is extremist, which really conflates to anybody who disagrees with them is an extremist. Well, then I'm an extremist. But it's a sad day when talking about our religious heritage or our constitutional rights constitutes being an extremist. But if that's what they want to call it, they can. But I don't take seriously the comments from the left, because they generally represent a party that has no platform by their own confirmation and expression. They have no platform. I think we all know what they're working towards, but they're reluctant to put it into writing, whereas the Republican Party, particularly in Idaho, has a beautiful platform. So I try to stand up for the platform. But those are two of the things that I've been counseled against bringing up, but I bring them up every time I give a public presentation.
It's funny too that you talk about that, because one of the other things that people have said not to talk about, and not to be so bold, and not to be so absolute on, is abortion. And you listed, I believe, one of your top priorities for your election was to take on abortion in a way that eliminates any kind of exemptions and loopholes. How do you feel about that today, and do people still counsel you to avoid that topic?
Not as much as in past years. I think the Supreme Court decision had a lot to do with that. Some of us broke the ice on the abortion issue, the pro-life issue, and then we were kind of bolstered in a big way by the Supreme Court's take on things. So I don't hear as often that I shouldn't bring that up, but it is my number one legislative objective. I worked with Senator Herndon to try to close two loopholes in our pro-life laws, namely the legalization of abortions for rape and incest. We both worked hard to try to get a bill that would do away with that through state affairs, and we failed in the print hearing. And this really troubled me, Wayne. I mean, I had to get up and leave the committee room, wound up bending the ear of the nearest state trooper because I needed to talk to somebody about how upset I was that this panel, consisting mostly of Republicans, so-called conservatives, would not even entertain the idea of closing those loopholes. And they said their stance was based on concern for people, concern for the mother. Well, how hypocritical to be concerned about one person and yet condemn an unborn to death simply because of the economic factors involved, or the social stigma involved, or quite frankly, all the work involved with going to term on a pregnancy and then raising a child. So it really bothered me that the so-called conservatives won't vote for life. And if you look at the U.S. Constitution, the Idaho Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, that all those documents talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or words generally to that effect. So that's job one, is to protect the constitutional rights of all Idahoans. And it really pains me that these gutless legislators won't stand up for the very seminal centerpiece of the platform they profess to support, the Republican platform, which of course is very pro-life. So it will be the centerpiece of my legislative efforts again. We will try again in state affairs in the Senate to try to get it at least through a print hearing and into a full committee hearing. But yeah, to me, that's job one. If we are allowing the codified murder of innocent unborn kids, then we need to remedy that. We need to fix that. And I think the majority of Idahoans support that. But our legislature as a whole won't publicly support it enough to get it through committee and onto the floor. And that troubles me. I mean,
Is
either
that is
you believe in what you believe in or you don't.
do they believe in it, or is that a political consideration? In other words, do they figure if they don't have to hear the bill, then they don't have to vote on it, and then they can go back home to their constituents and talk about how pro-life they are?
I think, Wayne, the majority of them believe in being pro-life and how evil abortion is and how unnecessary it is, quite frankly, and harmful to society. I think they actually believe that. But legislators suffer from an ailment, I've noticed. And the ailment is called I have to get reelected. And it's kind of a me syndrome. And what they need to understand is they have a legal, a moral, and a constitutional obligation to represent the people. And they represent the people by protecting the people's constitutional rights. Now, granted, if you stand for those principles, there are people who will disagree with you and won't vote for you. I think most of our legislators are good, decent people who believe in the pro-life movement for obvious reasons, but politically they're afraid. So I think it's mostly a political concern, and it's really a selfish concern. I'm not in the legislature to further my own cause, to further myself, to have a career, so to speak. I'm there to do a job. And if the rest of my fellow legislators would wake up to that fact and stop being so selfish and worried about reelection, just do your job. And the job, usually, the path forward to do your job is quite clear. Just read the Constitution.
Dan, you were in the legislature. I think you got elected in 2016, and then you were gone for a term, 2018 to 2000. Wait, did I do that right? 2018.
2017 and 18, I was there.
Okay, and then you were gone for a term, and then you just came back. Is
Yeah.
the Senate better or worse than it was, or the same as when you were there the first time?
It's basically the same. And a lot of people say, whoa, wait a minute. We have 10 really conservative, mostly new senators that have come in. And that's an improvement, and that's true. But when you look at the overarching mechanisms involved in how the Senate votes, it hasn't changed at all. The conservatives, and it used to be the vote in the Senate would be 34-1, and I was the one. And, there's no bragging here. That's just a sorry fact. Now it's 25-10 usually. And we're up against the same old unified party, which is the Democrats and the Rhinos combined. And they have the horsepower to outvote us on just about everything. So
So
it
the
hasn't.
outcome is really the same.
Yeah, the outcome is the same. The mechanism's a little bit different because we have improved. We've increased our numbers quite a bit, but we don't have the horsepower to change the final outcome.
But people should understand, and I just want to hone in on this for a second. When you have a 34-1 vote, typically what happens in the state Senate is they do what they call roll the votes. So they get a 35-0 vote, top of the calendar, and then the next bill comes along, and rather than having to read everybody's name and go through the process of voting, the member of leadership will stand up, usually the assistant majority leader will stand up and say, I ask unanimous consent that the roll call used on the previous bill now be used for this bill. And then the president says, there being no objection, the roll call on this bill is 35-0. So when you stand up and you kind of say, I want to cast the one no vote, or at least cast a no vote, and we'll see who comes along with me, you've put the entire Senate through an exercise that takes some bit of time. And there can be, little glances in your direction that aren't terribly positive, that you made them go through that whole exercise of going through the roll call just to get your one no vote. And I'd imagine that the pressure to not do that is significantly intense.
Well, every morning, Wayne, I would come in with, I'd call it my no vote sheet. And there'd probably be, let's say we were going to vote on 20 bills that day. I'd probably had a no vote listed on that sheet, which I'd give to the assistant majority leader for about 80% of those votes. And they knew they couldn't roll on those. And I never really got any pushback from leadership on that. In fact, they were quite cordial. They would say, thank you. So now we know, and we won't be embarrassed by trying to roll the vote and waste time trying to do that. But I'm sure behind the scenes, they were rolling their eyes. And there were various legislators that would look at me and shoot me the glance. And I'd hear the little cat calls, the whispers about, oh, here's Senator No, he's going to vote no. Well, you know what, Wayne? Nuts to them. I have one vote, and I'll vote as I darn well see fit in accordance with what my constituents want, what the Constitution says, and what's good for the entire state of Idaho, not just my district. The media was very fond of calling me Senator No, and that's just the way it is. If I like a bill, if it's good, if it's sound, if it's constitutional, if it's something we need, I'll vote for it. I'll stand up and debate for it. But conversely, if it's a bad bill, I'm not going to be cowed into voting no. And I'll tell you, there are very many senators who look to leadership. I mean, physically look to leadership during a vote. They'll usually pass on the first round of votes, look to leadership to see how they vote, and they'll vote the same way. I couldn't care less how leadership votes. They have one vote, I have one vote. And they've never, to their credit, they've never put pressure on me to vote a certain way. But yeah, some people roll their eyes, and the media, of course, has a field day with it. Well, that's fine. I'm a 30-year combat vet and a retired police officer. They want to talk about pressure. They want to talk about, putting somebody under the gun. These folks are pikers compared to what I've been through in my life. So, and that's good. That's good because I'm pretty immune to whatever they want to throw at me.
So what was the hardest? I know you get your principles, but there must be bills that kind of vex you a little bit. Was there one last legislative session where you just weren't sure what to do, and ultimately you cast a vote, and that was more difficult than perhaps normal, or they just, or they you just run them past your filter and you know exactly what it is you're going to do?
Well, for the most part, I run it through my filter, and I know what I'm going to do. There were a couple bills where I had to give it a second thought or a third thought. One was the execution bill, the firing squad bill, because I understand the dilemma that the state was trying to avoid, and for good reason. And the bill had some merit, but it was against my moral principles. So ultimately, that's my final default position: is the moral filter, whatever that produces. And so I voted against it. And then there was a pro-gun bill, and I'm very pro-Second Amendment. I mean, look up Second Amendment in the dictionary. I think my picture would be right next to it. But it was the expose a firearm if you feel confronted. You have the legal right to expose it. And as a retired police officer, I had to agree with the intent of the bill, so I had to think twice about it. But in terms of the practical application of that bill, I think it's bad because I think it will induce some people to do the Yahoo maneuver and expose their weapon when they shouldn't. And that can precipitate some really bad things. And on the floor of the Senate, I said, as a police officer, I never drew my firearm unless I was prepared to use it. You don't pull it out as a bluff because that can precipitate some really nasty things. So those were two bills. But if I go back to my first session when we voted on whether or not the state should interfere in the family decision with respect to medical care for minors, when the family leadership, mom and dad, say, no, we're not going to take our child to the daughter, even though the medical community says we have a cure or a Band-Aid fix, which will keep your child alive. But because of religious beliefs, they chose not to avail themselves of the medical community's efforts. That was a tough one. That was one where I had to balance my moral concern for human life against the constitutional requirement or restriction that families and individuals should be allowed to manage their own personal lives. So there was no right or wrong answer. That was a tough one. I saw senators, rhinos, conservatives, Democrats, you name it, they all wrestled with that. And I
Yeah.
took a lot of heat for my vote. But to this day, I can explain my vote, and most people see my point of view. They may not agree with me, but there was no right or wrong answer to that. That's the only bill that really, no matter how much you think it, you can't come to a crystal clear right or wrong answer.
And some people don't understand, and I try to explain this a lot, that bills are contain words, and words have meanings, and meanings have consequences. So we talk conceptually about those things. So as you describe this legislation, I'm thinking back in my head, I remember some of the conversation around these different bills, but the words in the bills matter. And for example, on that concealed carry bill, I think we had that rated as a -1. But when you initially look at that, when you hear about it, you're like, okay, this is supposed to be resolving an issue that ended up in the state Supreme Court where a person displayed their weapon, and we think that this solves that problem to where they're not going to be adjudicated for that. But that opened up the way that bill was worded opened up a series of other problems going down the road in terms of the application of the Second Amendment. So we had rated it negatively, and there are folks who voted for it or against it for a variety of different reasons. But the point is that bills are complicated. Sometimes it sounds good when you first hear about it. The internet porn filter bill is a great example of that. It sounds really good. The government's going to tell people they have to, phone manufacturers have to do a certain thing in order to participate in the Idaho marketplace. But what does that bill do, and what does it actually say, and how does that work? It's very, very complicated.
Yeah, I agree. I voted against it, and people said, "Well, are you supporting children being able to see internet pornography?" And I said, "No, absolutely not. But what I'm supporting is people's right to choose, number one, and the parents' authority to manage their own children the way they see fit. It's not within government's charter to force people to do the right thing. We have freedom of choice." And like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were fond of saying, our republic gives us tremendous freedoms. But along with those freedoms come responsibilities to use the freedoms properly. And if we ever become an immoral or uncaring society, the very freedoms that support all the things we love about America will destroy us. And,
Right.
and it's not government's charter to stick its nose under our tent and force us to do the right thing. Uh,
And people have to use that responsibility. If they don't use that responsibility, they ultimately never understand how to use it.
right, exactly.
They,
So I,
they,
I voted against it. And, quite frankly, there's a mechanism in place, and it probably was active for that bill and many others. I think the governor, and pick a governor, any governor, they weigh in, they kind of swerve out of their constitutional lane a little bit, and weigh in on the speaker maybe, but for sure on the pro tem. Since I'm in the Senate, I've seen this. And then the pro tem kind of weighs in on the senators to vote a certain way. And it's an unholy merging of the legislative and executive branches. And what it does is it alienates the voter, because we in the legislative branch are supposed to represent the wishes of our constituency as long as it's moral and constitutional. And when one man weighs in and says, this is what I want, and then the entire legislative mechanism conforms to that desire by one person, it cuts the people right out of the picture. And I'll argue this with anybody, but that is the mechanism that's in place. And that is not representative government. So a lot of these bills that come down, you scratch your head and you go, where's this coming from? And why are so many legislators supporting this when there are very valid constitutional arguments against it, common sense arguments. It's because the political system headed by the executive branch wants this to be signed into law. And we need to remedy that.
The launch program is, I think, an example of that, right? That's the bill that allocated $8,000 for every high school student in an in-demand career, and the Senate kind of balked at that at first, but then you could tell that the leadership and members of the key committees were just determined to come up with a solution so the governor could have his program.
The senators did balk at it, Wayne. They strongly balked at it, and I was encouraged by that. But what happened was that mechanism that I just described was employed by the powers that be to sway people to support House Bill 24, the launch bill, which was nothing but political payback and shifted the cost of employee training and education from the employer onto the taxpayer, and did so selectively with the state picking winners and losers. I spoke strongly against that in committee. It was a bad bill. It's the epitome of government overreach and cronyism, and it highlights how that mechanism that's in place, the executive branch putting pressure on the pro tem, who puts pressure on the senators, it highlighted how that actually operates in day-to-day practice. And it's frustrating. I work with good people in the Senate, accomplished people, intelligent people, but they don't, for the most part, they don't have a backbone. And I can't get my mind around that. I guess it's politics, but we need to rise above that.
To put a little bow on that whole thing, also people need to understand that that was really an education-related bill, and it went through through your committee, the Senate Commerce Committee, because it couldn't pass the Education Committee, so they turned it into a commerce-related bill just so it can get around the conservatives in the Senate Education Committee, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and the professed justifications, and there were many for that little maneuver, were laughable. And every senator in the Republican caucus, I think, absolutely knew what was going on. And some did speak out against that, but they were the conservative senators who generally are more prone to speak out. But yeah, it's there's some things that need to change, and they won't change unless people bring them into the light of day, and the power of the people is invoked. And, in our state and in our nation, the people have tremendous power, but they don't use it because they've been told and dumbed down into thinking that they don't have power and that they shouldn't be concerned and that they should just trust government. Well, I've been in government for 45 years plus, and I can tell you right now, it's a beautiful system, but we need to be very careful who we put into that system, because those are the people who bring it to life. So more attention needs to be paid by the voters as to who occupies the state house and what they're doing.
Dan, in just a couple minutes we have left, you mentioned abortion as something you wanted to address next legislative session. What other topics are you concerned about that you hope will come up that you'll either bring or you expect will have to rise to the surface next time?
Well, funny you should ask, Wayne. I just happen to have my little list right here of things I
glad
want
I asked.
And of course, you mentioned I want to close the two loopholes in our pro-life laws, but I want to reintroduce my militia bill, which gets rid of an old, outdated, unconstitutional law that says you and I, as a group, can't walk down Main Street if we're carrying firearms if we call ourselves a group. I got it through the Senate, but I couldn't get a hearing in the House. I also want to introduce my patient Bill of Rights and campus carry bills. The Bill of Rights is being driven by the horrible genocide we saw during COVID, which is a whole nother topic. I could talk for hours on that. And my campus carry simply says state law is state law. It should apply everywhere. the university shouldn't be able to amend or change the
You made a
campus
little
carry
progress with
rules.
that last time, didn't you?
Yeah, let me look here. Campus carry. Yeah, I had to trade it in state affairs to get another bill heard. There was some pushback on the campus carry, and the chairman, who I think is a pretty good guy, actually said, "Hey, look, how about we just table that for now and let's focus on your other bill," which had some pushback too. So I had to do some horse trading, but I'll bring it back. I want to call for an adjutant general investigation into the state's response to COVID and also the medical community's response to COVID. A lot of people suffered at the hands of government. A lot of businesses went out of business. They closed churches, they closed schools. Well, the last time I checked, Wayne, there's no emergency clause on the Bill of Rights. Now, we can't let this slide under the bridge, or we can't let them sweep it under the rug, because all indications are they could revisit us with this same sort of thing. They're already talking about it.
They are.
Now, the mechanism to bring this to light, I don't know if it's going to be an investigation by a legislative committee or a joint resolution or a joint memorial, but we need to somehow get this into the adjutant general's office, not adjutant general, but attorney general's office, and get them working on this, because I firmly believe what we witnessed was global genocide. And we need a Nuremberg style investigation, not just in Idaho. Maybe Idaho can get the ball started, but we need it nationwide, if not worldwide, because the human race actually was under attack from some of the very organizations we've grown to depend on. Where was the FDA, the CDC, the WHO? Some of our medical providers in Idaho, not all for a fact, but some were very heavy-handed with people. The forced mask mandates, closing of schools and churches, the administering of what was basically an experimental drug without informed written consent, which is required by the Nuremberg Code and federal law. Our troops were given experimental drugs and there was no informed consent effort made. We, as free citizens of this country, should not tolerate that. And if we let this pass under the bridge without bringing it out into the light of day, we will suffer from it again. So that's something I'm going to try to get started. I want to cap government growth. I want to tie growth to some sort of appropriate inflation index and say the executive branch can't increase or grow government more than X%, because the X% is what's reflected in this inflation index. And that would apply to individual agencies and the government as a whole. And it would be a start, at least. And also, I want to introduce a bill to withdraw Idaho from Medicaid. That's $4.5 billion that we give to people in the form of welfare. The state should not be in the welfare business at all. There is no legal, even moral or constitutional mandate to provide free things to people. If we could stop the legalized theft called welfare, that money that the government takes away from us without any say-so on our part could remain in the private sector, could go to churches and private charities who, like years ago, used to handle the welfare situation more efficiently and effectively than government does. The Department of Health and Welfare needs to be reined in, as I think is evidenced by recent events, but we need to get out of the welfare business entirely. Now, I know that'll go over like a proverbial turd in the punch bowl, and I probably won't even get a print hearing on it, but somebody needs to break the ice. It's not my job as a senator to pay for people's housing or for their meals or transportation or their health care. We live in a capitalist society, which is the best thing going. Nobody's come up with anything better, but the state should not be involved in welfare. And it's not sustainable, to borrow a phrase from the left or a word from the left. $4.5 billion. I mean,
it's the biggest program in all of state government.
Yeah, and they persist. Every year it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Somebody needs to be the voice of reason, and I say let's get right down to the bedrock on this issue. Why are we doing this at all? There's no constitutional mandate or requirement, none. How did government get into the welfare business? I mean, what's next? We're going to buy people homes. We're going to buy them cars. We're going to pay for their school, their health care. That's not the role of government. Period. Dot. End of discussion.
Well, you
And
should also know that in the last 60 years, that almost 60 years that we've had the medical welfare program in place, no one has ever asked, there's never been any kind of official government study to say, what are the secondary effects of this program? What are the trade-offs? As Thomas Sowell would say, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. So what did you trade off? Well, you described it. You traded off for a government centralized program the effectiveness of churches, charities, communities, families, neighbors, all that. They've been diminished as a result of the increase in this big government bureaucracy program.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And it really pains me and scares me when I hear senators say it's government's job to take care of people. No, 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 it's not government's job to take care of people. It's government's job to administer certain core functions and to protect people's constitutional rights. The rest of it in our republic is up to us as individuals. It's up to neighbors, friends, family members, churches. That's the American way. And somehow government has morphed into this colossal beast that thinks it has to regulate every aspect of human endeavor. It's no good at doing that. It's very ineffective and inefficient, and it can't afford to do that. And another thing I'd like to look at is the fentanyl situation. I have firsthand experience with that. I've got quite a few family members that are in law enforcement, and they've been exposed to fentanyl on traffic stops. And I'm here to tell you that stuff is so powerful. It can take a 6'3", 230-pound athlete, deputy sheriff, and put him on the ground in about 2 seconds. It's absolutely frightening. And
It's a
that's
poison.
happened to my family members who are in law enforcement. And we need to step up to this threat, and we need to hammer it.
100%. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And you're on the Judiciary Committee, so maybe you can lead in that discussion on the Senate side. So
Yeah.
hats off to you. You got a lot of really, really tough issues on the table, and I appreciate it. I always tell people senators, representatives, with the exception of the people in leadership, get paid exactly the same, regardless of whether they take on the tough issues or not. And so, you doing that is very much appreciated. And
Well,
I'm
thanks.
grateful. Yeah, grateful for you being on the program today too. You don't have to do that either.
No, I love talking to you, and Wayne, I have to say, I appreciate everything you do and everything the IFF does and stands for. I think the IFF is the leading driving force for putting the truth out to Idahoans, for standing up for constitutional rights and small, honest, and efficient and effective government. And I'd hate to think where we would be at without the assistance of your organization. I know as a sitting senator working with your staff, boy, what a godsend. Things get hectic, they get busy, the bills come flowing in, and having a trusted source that has great analytical ability to go over all these bills in rapid fashion, boy, I'll tell you, it's a lifesaver. And I know you guys take a lot of heat. I take a lot of heat, but that just means you're over the target.
Thank you. That means a lot. It really does. And it's good to be in the fight with somebody like you, truly.
Thank you.
It makes a big difference when we have friends that we could talk to about these issues, and they get it and they know where we're coming from. So thank you. And thanks again for being on the program. And thanks to all of you for watching. And we'll be back again really soon with another episode. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.